Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Erin. I've met some of you, but for those I haven't met yet, I work with volunteers here at AARP Minnesota. I'm joined today by Mark, who's one of our AARP volunteers on our speakers team and on our advocacy team. And then also Joe, who's going to help us out today with some of our Zoom behind the scenes. And we have just 30 minutes here together. So we're going to just kind of like give you a lot of information in a short amount of time. But if you have any questions, I invite you to put those in the chat. Joe's going to be watching those for us, and then we'll do a little bit of Q&A at the end of the session. So as you think of questions, feel free to stick those in the chat. And then just to kind of get things warmed up in the chat today, we'd love to know where you're joining us from so we can see a little bit about who's in the virtual room today. So if you would put in the chat, it will already say your name, but let us know where you are joining from. That would be great. Just a quick preview of where we're headed in these next 30 minutes. We're going to tell you a little bit about AARP as a whole. And then we are going to jump into our focus for today, which is telling you about our 2025 legislative session and our particular campaign that we're running this year. And then we're going to tell you about our advocacy team of volunteers and how those folks really help us to make this all happen, and what it looks and feels like to be an advocacy volunteer with AARP. And at that point, we hope that we have piqued your interest, so we'll talk about next steps for getting involved. So since you have joined us today, I'm assuming you know at least a little bit about AARP, but sometimes people are surprised to know that AARP has state offices in every state, including also Puerto Rico, DC. And we do local and state advocacy work in addition to some community engagement and educational resources. We here at AARP in Minnesota are a part of this kind of top part of our organizational structure. We're a nonprofit, a 501c4, which allows us to do some of our advocacy work. We're a social mission organization, and our mission is to empower people to choose how they live as they age. So that really is the core of our work. And then AARP as a big organization has a couple other entities. The AARP Foundation is our direct service. So if you've ever heard of TaxAid, which is a huge volunteer effort that helps people do their taxes for free during tax season, that's an example of the type of program the AARP Foundation runs. We also have AARP Services. That is the membership arm of the organization, does the licensing of AARP's names, the rewards, the benefits you might have seen as a volunteer. So that is a separate part of an organization, and there really is kind of a firewall between us here in the 501c4 and the AARP services. And then lastly, there are a few affiliated charities. So just to give you a little sense of where we are in the AARP world as the Minnesota State Office. And what we have kind of three arms of our efforts. We do advocacy, education and resources, and community engagement. And so those are kind of the three buckets our activities fall under. We're going to be really focused today on the advocacy bucket, but just to let you know, we do community events all over the state. For instance, this photo is from the state fair, and Rory, I put you in the slideshow without even knowing that you would be here today. So we have a special guest attending who's actually in our photograph from helping out at the state fair. We were talking about voter engagement, our big issues, saying that, hey, making sure Social Security is sustainable and supporting family caregivers are voter engagement election year issues. Ask of your candidates, ask of your lawmakers that they have a plan for these things. So we try and be out talking about issues that matter to AARP and our membership in a fun way, in fun places. AARP has just like a huge breadth of what we work on. But to just kind of give you a little summary, you'll see on the screen those kind of big buckets of financial resilience, health security, and social connections. That's really where we're trying to do our work. And then here at AARP Minnesota, we focus even a little further on the items you see in red. Those are the things that we're really focused on for 2025. And you'll see that fraud prevention and awareness is one of those. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark, volunteer from the speaker and advocacy team, to tell us a little bit about what we have going from an advocacy and fraud perspective this year.
Thanks, Aaron. Fraud is unfortunately a big deal. According to the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, there have been more than 22,000 fraud reports here in Minnesota just in the first 3 quarters of this year, with losses to folks coming to about $103 million. So it's unfortunately quite common. There are lots of different scams out there, and it's pretty hard to avoid being contacted by someone who's wanting to get hold of your money. I know I unfortunately had a friend, a very smart, very capable friend, who got taken in, and I'll bet some of you have had that happen too, unfortunately. I'm kind of interested, if you know someone who's gotten a phone call that you think is a scam or has been scammed, raise your hand. I'm just kind of curious to see who's been touched by this. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's unfortunately quite a common and very sad thing. As an example, back in 2020, there was a couple down in Hennepin County who got a telephone call. They actually were kept on the phone for several hours as the scammers worked to gain their trust, convinced them to pay taxes in advance in order to win a particular prize. The couple ended up losing more than $100,000. And unfortunately, the police were not able to find out who were the perpetrators of that scam. And the money so was never recovered. Unfortunately, that happens. Scams of all different sizes happen pretty regularly, and AARP hears about them pretty regularly. It's particularly profound when dealing with older folks, because we are all at a time in our lives where we're least able to recover financially. We don't have the time necessarily to wait out the stock market. We're not typically working at the jobs we had before we retired. So there are few viable options to be able to make up that money. And that's why we are now, in this next legislative session, going to be pushing for passage of the Fraud Restitution Fund, the Consumer Fraud Restitution Fund. This is going to be for victims of fraud. Yeah, you can go to the next one. Yep, good, thanks. And this is going to be a government program housed within the Attorney General's office for victims of fraud. It's modeled after a federal Consumer Financial Protection Bureau civil penalty fund. Okay, lots of words there. So it's difficult to kind of work through them. But the point of that fund and of this fund is to provide some financial relief to folks who have fallen victim to different scams. And of course, it would be particularly beneficial for older folks like us who are no longer working and need some financial recovery. I'm going to kind of walk you through this. It's a complex thing, but I'll try to simplify it. Typically, if there's been a report of fraud that's made, it goes through the legal system. The Attorney General's office monitors the kinds of reports that come through, and may elect to move forward in a court case on behalf of the individuals who have been defrauded. And typically then, if there is a finding that the people were defrauded, there's restitution that's ordered to the people who have been defrauded, and there's oftentimes civil penalties that are assessed in addition to that. What this fund will do is take excess money from those civil penalties and put it into this fraud restitution fund. And that's particularly important because that money will then be used to provide restitution to people who have been scammed in situations where we've been unable to find or bring the perpetrators of the fraud to justice. For example, if an internet provider or internet sales or a telecom company imposes a bunch of junk fees that ends up being deemed fraud, they would have typically be ordered by the court to provide restitution, and then there would be civil penalties placed on top of that. That extra money would then be what goes in to compensate victims of the other frauds, which we'll talk about in a minute, things like a romance fraud, where someone has worked to gain your trust, suggests that you're really attractive, and scams you out a bunch of money. The proposed restitution fund is primarily going to be used where it's difficult to apprehend the perpetrator. So getting money back to the people who have reported the financial crimes is a great thing. We want to encourage people to report those crimes, and we want to incentivize the Attorney General's office to be going after those people so that they can get the reward of actually helping people who have been scammed. All of this is subject to court order. So it's not a question of people just walking in and saying, "Hi, I've been scammed." There are good controls that will be on this to ensure that only true victims would be receiving the money. It's important to note that the federal Consumer Civil Penalty Fund that I mentioned has been working. It's actually been in operation for about 10 years. So it's gone through Republican and Democratic administrations, and it's paid out to victims of fraud more than $650 million. I think the number is 671 million. And that's to people who would not otherwise have received compensation for their loss. So there's a real benefit to folks who are scammed, but we haven't been able to find out who the perpetrator is. Some examples here of the kinds of things that you might deal with are predatory real estate scams. That's a situation where that was just dealt with here in the last legislative session, where there was an organization that was promising to take care of selling folks' homes for them. Unfortunately, it also ended up where the people signed contracts without reading them, and they obligated these folks, the scammers, to be responsible for selling the house for the next 40 years. So a new person could buy the house and then be obligated to follow the same scam. A horrible situation. Managed to get that done. Contractor scams, the roofing people who show up, demand a huge deposit before they start work, and then never show up, take the money and run away. The romance scam that I mentioned earlier, someone calls, they may spend a lot of time on the phone, making you feel all sorts of warm and fuzzy, and then coincidentally, you just want a little money to help out, help tide them over. They keep going on with that, and then they disappear, taking your money. You don't know who the person is. You may never have met them. And they've really been taking advantage of your own good nature. And identity theft, which of course is rampant. I'm sure you're familiar with that. So big issues, and lots of different types of fraud. So a little bit here about what it means to become an AARP advocacy volunteer. So we play, actually, those of us who are involved in it play a large role. We've had a lot of successes here at the legislature. In the last few years, we've been dealing with some major issues and some minor issues. Sometimes there are big things going on and sometimes some small things going on. But we've generally been pretty successful, and a lot of that's because of the AARP advocacy volunteers, and the AARP members. We bring lots of emails, we make lots of phone calls to our legislators, and that's all important. I will never forget one time we were working on dealing with the Paid Family Medical Leave Act, and we had been collecting cards from people within our districts. I brought about a pile of cards about this high into my state senator, handed it to the legislative assistant there, and his comment was, "Oh, wow." Had difficulty believing that there was this level of desire for that program in the district. That's really important stuff. It has a major impact on what happens here in the state, what happens within your district. We regularly talk with legislators. We go talk with them, we make phone calls, and volunteers are primarily the direct contact with legislators. We are the ones who are responsible for establishing relationships with them and communicating the actual experience of what people are actually going through, as opposed to a high level strategic kind of thing. Typical activities that we're involved in, a lot of it is contacting our local elected officials and building those relationships. It really is important to understand, if you've never had the opportunity or the desire to go talk to your elected official, that AARP does not turn you loose and just say, go do something, without giving you a lot of training and a lot of resources. You will probably have an opportunity to be trained more than any advocate for any other organization in the state. I've talked with other and compared this with advocates from other nonprofit organizations, and they're kind of surprised really at what AARP does to get us all trained and up to speed on being able to handle this. It's also important to understand that you can select your level of involvement with this stuff. You don't have to all be going to meeting legislators. You can be making phone calls, you can be sending emails, you can be doing things from the comfort of your home too. And that's just as important, because it shows that kind of grassroots impact that we really need in order to be able to make things better here for seniors throughout the state. AARP will provide you with the materials, they will provide you with scripts, they will provide you with handouts. Aaron may even have a handout here to talk a little bit about fraud if it's not already in the chat box. And so you're never going to be left alone. We also have mentor programs within AARP, so you'll be paired if you want with someone who's done this for a number of years. So you are not out there fighting against the wind. So making that contact is important. The other important thing that we may do, or some of us do, is attending key events at legislative sessions. It's a great, going to committee hearings, for example, is a great way to actually learn about the content of the bills, in addition to having the AARP materials. This year, we're going to have not only the usual team training, but we're going to have some fraud education events. We're going to have a lobby day when all of us get together, and it's going to be great. The other thing we need is to have people let us know of stories, because those live stories have a great impact on legislators. Erin, I think you're going to talk about some key upcoming events.
Yes, thank you so much, Mark. So this slide here has some of our key dates for the team. As Mark mentioned, things are really flexible, so we want you to join us for what you can. If you can't, that's okay. But just to give you a sense of kind of the time commitment and the scope of the legislative session this year, that team training starts right away in January, and that's a deep dive where we'll talk about the Fraud Restitution Fund in greater detail than we have today. We'll talk about how to have a conversation, a meeting with your lawmaker. Some experienced volunteers will role play with you a little bit so that you can practice And we'll talk about all those other grassroots elements. We have a couple of virtual events that you can participate in. And then the other large one is that March 13th Lobby Day, where we try and get as many advocates and AARP volunteers as we can to the Capitol to really show our presence and our enthusiasm for the fraud restitution bill that we'll be working on. We also have some optional Thursdays at the Capitol. Again, it shows presence, interest in these issues. Volunteers do things like listen in on those committee meetings, drop notes or letters off at their legislators' offices, maybe pull a lawmaker out of a meeting or a floor session to talk with them. And as Mark said, it's really all the relationships that you are able to build with your lawmakers. You're their constituent, that you are in their district, you can represent people 50 plus and what is important and be kind of that real face and voice to these issues. Again, also like Mark said, we try and provide as much training and support as we can. So just a quick look at what that looks like. We have an e-course that you can take online, your own time, your own pace. You can do that whenever you would like. That January 8th training, you can attend it in person or virtually. If you're outside of the Twin Cities metro area and would be traveling to St. Paul, if you want to attend in person, we can do hotel rooms and reimburse mileage. So if you want to attend that in person, we're happy to help host you and make sure you have a place to stay overnight. The team also has regular team meetings through the legislative session. They're going to be on the second Wednesday of the month from 10 to 11. Again, you can participate virtually or from our state office in St. Paul. And then we keep you in the loop through a weekly newsletter that my colleague Erin Paris sends out, and by connecting you with other volunteers, perhaps who are also in your district or perhaps who have some experience that could help support you as you get started with the team. You do not need to come to the advocacy team with prior advocacy experience. We will provide the training, we will provide the support. What we do ask of you is that you have a commitment to the goals and priorities of AARP and to learning about the issues that we're working on, and that you are able to participate in a nonpartisan manner. AARP is a nonpartisan organization, meaning we'll never support or provide funding to a particular party or candidate. We really will work with any lawmaker, any candidate who is will engage on the issues that matter to people 50 plus. My colleague Erin, I've heard her say several times, if in the same day she's been told AARP is too liberal and too conservative within 5 hours, she knows she's doing her job right, because we really are trying to work across the aisle however we can to get these priorities done. Some other support we provide for volunteers is we do mileage reimbursement for any training or any trips to the Capitol. We will reimburse for parking, for Metro Transit, Metro Mobility, things like that. Also, you might have seen some red vests in the photos. We'll provide those to you to wear to the Capitol. And again, they're just kind of a symbol for lawmakers. They know the red vest, they know it's AARP, and they know okay, there's some support and some energy behind these issues with AARP. Mark, is there anything that we haven't talked about today that you feel like would be helpful to share from your perspective as an advocacy volunteer?
Well, I think it's important to note that not only do we deal with all of this heavy legislative stuff, but we're also a great group. Minnesotans as a group, we're all above average. And let me say that the advocacy folks are above average. So we have a fun group. You're dealing with, I'd like to think, intelligent folks who have an interest in making the world a better place and making Minnesota a better place. I have to say, I joined AARP about 2 years after I retired, and it's been a hoot. So I appreciate that. Appreciate working with the staff in Minnesota. I also want to emphasize the AARP's nonpartisanship. You'll note, if you're really into legislative stuff, this presentation has been nonpartisan. In an earlier slide, you saw Representative Kelly Mortensen, I believe. Morrison, I'm sorry. Ugh, the mind goes. Who is a Democrat. You'll see in this particular photo, we're standing with Senator Carla Nelson, who's a Republican from the Rochester area. So the nonpartisanship is really important. Great fun. So, Erin.
Awesome. All right.
We do have some questions.
Okay, let me do a few more things and then we'll do some questions. So if you are interested, want to learn more, or want to get involved, we would absolutely love to have you. We'll send these next steps in an email following this session, along with some of those key dates. But what it looks like next is doing a short kind of onboarding conversation with me. It can be on Zoom or by phone. And we just like to get to know you a little bit, where you're coming from, what your interests are, how you think you might want to engage with the advocacy team. And then we ask you, if you can, to save that date, save January 8th, because that really is our kickoff, training, everything you would need to launch into the session. So if you can, mark that date on your calendar now, and we'll have registration ready for that soon. I also like to share, if you don't think that joining the advocacy team as a volunteer is right for you, but you still want to stay involved, you can become an e-activist. And what that is you'll join our bi-monthly newsletter, where you'll get updates on these issues, what is happening during the legislative session, and you'll be able to take action on issues that matter to you. So we'll have things like a hand raiser, where we're letting lawmakers know, like, hey, this many people across Minnesota are looking to you to act on this issue. And so you can participate in that way. It's a little less kind of in-person engagement, but it is a way to kind of follow our work and stay involved and lend your voice to the effort. So with that, I know we are getting very close to 11. I can stay and do questions as long as we have them. But if anyone needs to leave right at 11, I just want to say thank you for joining. Watch for an email from me shortly, and I hope to see you with our advocacy team come 2025. So with that, Joe, do you want to send some questions our way?
Yep. So the first one I have is from Terry, and it says, how many states already have such a fund?
Good question. Mark, correct me if I'm wrong. And again, I have colleagues who know this very, very well, and you will meet them soon. This is what I think I remember. I think that Minnesota would be the first to have this exact fund, but it is based on the federal version. So they're modeling it after that, but I do think that this is new, I believe. Does that sound right, Mark?
That sounds right. There might be another one, but the point is, it's a very new, leading edge kind of thing.
And Terry, I will confirm that. I will follow up with my colleagues and confirm that the answer to that.
The next question is from Jim Glass, and Jim asked, do we know how many excess dollars went into the state's general fund in recent years?
Jim, it's a great question. My understanding is that they are working on figuring out what that exact number is, but that it has been hard to track down. And what that tells you is that the legislature, they don't depend on this money to fund things, because it's so unpredictable. It really depends on what the Attorney General's office does in a particular year, what the cases are. And the fact that they're having such a hard time tracking it down really tells us that they're not depending on it. So they're working on it. We don't know the answer yet, but we hope to have that soon.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I would think, when you go to talk to the legislators, that would be a question they would have. So
We're working on getting that. Great point.
thanks.
And then Pete asks, in which session do we share our story with senators and lawmakers?
Mark, can I have you take this one? When have you been able to share your personal experience?
Yeah, typically I do that when I do an introductory meeting. There's going to be always a period of them wanting to get to know you. That's part of the relationship building over time that we want to have, and so that's really the most appropriate time to be able to do it, when you're sitting down face to face. But doing it over the phone too is also important.
Awesome.
And Pete also asked, but I think Pete's already had this answered, but do we get reimbursed for mileage to drive to events and to the Capitol for the advocacy work? Which the answer Aaron answered was absolutely yes. And for parking and all that good stuff. Hotels.
Any training, any activity, the answer is yes. And
you come to the portal where I work to submit those reimbursement requests, and I can help you with that. And then Pete also asked, can Minnesota scam victims apply to federal consumer civil penalty fund as well? If so, how?
I don't know the answer to that. Mark, do you know that one?
I don't know. I think the thing to do would be to check the CFPB's website. They would have that information. Okay, cool. And I'll see if my colleagues have some additional help that we can provide too, and I'll follow up with you, Pete. Good question. Any other questions you can put in the chat? You can come off of mute.
If I missed any, please let me know. Anybody?
Hi, this is Jim. I was just typing it up, but it's probably easier just to ask it. Do you know, or like how, if you're, you know, if you're gonna be talking to legislators, is it just the legislators that you know, represent your personal district, or are there other ones? And I guess if it is just the ones that represent your district, how do you make sure you get them all covered? Because, or do you have that many? Do you actually have volunteers, advocacy volunteers in just about every district?
I'll take this one. What we do is you're going to typically have two for your district. One will be a representative, and you will have one senator who you'll want to contact. So it's two people who you will be primarily responsible for. Those are the folks who you would go typically and have a sit-down meeting with. As a matter of reality, though, we'll talk to multiple legislators, but we'll typically do that in a group. Because although we are advocates, we are not lobbyists, and so we don't want to be talking with too many who are not where we do not have a constituent relationship, because that could be construed as lobbying.
Oh, really?
And Jim, that's kind of part of our effort on like days like today. We're trying to get as many advocates as we can statewide, so that we do have volunteers who can talk to their own lawmaker in as many districts as we can. So you'll really get to focus your relationship building on your own lawmaker. But as Aaron mentioned earlier, we pull people off the floor, in which case you might be in a group. We're talking to a different legislator from a different group. I've had lunches, again, in a group setting with other representatives and senators who are not mine. So there will be contact with others, but you'll primarily be responsible for your own.
Okay. Oh, that's good to know. Thanks.
I do have another question. Just okay.
Yeah.
Terry asks, is the advocacy focus mostly state level, or are there federal level opportunities with elected officials or federal agencies?
That's a good question. I think, and Mark, you jump in here too. I think a lot of our opportunities are state level, but there are some federal level opportunities. For instance, in the last year, we've been working a lot about supporting family caregivers, and there's some federal legislation around that. So we had some opportunities on that. And then we've been talking a lot about Social Security, make it sustainable. So there were some contact with our federal lawmakers around that. Mark, what has been your experience?
We're typically very focused. If there is a federal issue that has a state impact, we certainly work with our federal officials, and we will oftentimes, or occasionally, I guess would be more appropriate, get comments from the AARP national folks who are asking us to follow up on something they are working on with our state people. So it works both ways. But yes, there are those opportunities, as Aaron talked about.
Sherry had a good question about our January 8th training. It is going to be recorded. So if you're not able to make it or able to make it for part of it, we'll have those recordings available for you of the different sessions as well. Any other questions we can help with?
Yeah. Does AARP offer legal guidance on cases or point to which firms to talk to? From Pete.
Pete, could you say a little bit more about your question?
Yeah, sure. So my question was, obviously when there's a large sum of money involved, there are law firms that handle such cases. When there are social media companies involved, such as Facebook or Instagram, where most of the scams are happening, and you want to consider your case for whether you should, consider a lawsuit against them or not, or has there been precedence? I know that Attorney General Keith Ellison, there's a class action lawsuit against Facebook on another issue, which is they're too big and they kind of buy out competitors and crush any sort of they have monopoly in the market. So there is a lawsuit out there. So just general guidance on what are the legal options to consider.
I think that all of that would run through the Attorney General's office. I don't think AARP would provide any guidance or input. Mark, do you have any thoughts?
No, typically AARP would not get involved in something like that. As a practical matter, though, there are oftentimes multiple nonprofit organizations that lobby on similar issues, and you might run into them in the course of working at the state capitol, and those folks may be able to, and often do, provide guidance that's more within their mission to help you out.
Yeah, I lodged my case with AG's office, and basically Facebook did some investigation and said, well, we closed the case, and thank you very much.
Okay, I see. Thanks, Pete. Deborah, I see in the chat, says who can attend the training, and it's any volunteer, anyone who's interested in getting involved in our advocacy efforts for 2025. Great. Well, I thank you so much for the wonderful questions, for coming today. I'm going to follow up with an email for next steps and save the dates. I really do hope that Mark and I see you at training or at one of our advocacy activities in 2025. If you have any questions, don't hesitate. You can email me, call me, anything you might think of later today that you're wondering about, don't hesitate to reach out. And thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Take care.